The rain was relentless, hammering down on the city like 1,000 accusations, each drop a reminder of something Michael Lancaster could never wash away. He stood in the dimly lit parking lot of a rundown diner, his tailored suit soaked through, clinging to his skin as if it, too, wanted to punish him. His breath came in shallow gasps, and his hands trembled as he clutched a crumpled photograph, its edges frayed from years of being hidden away. Across from him, a woman stood under the flickering neon sign, her face half-shadowed, her eyes blazing with a fire that could burn through steel. In her arms, a small boy clung to her, his tiny face buried in her coat, oblivious to the storm raging around them. "You don't get to walk back into our lives like this," she said, her voice cutting through the rain, sharp and unyielding. "Not after everything. Not after you forgot us." Her words were a blade, slicing into the carefully constructed walls Michael had built around his heart. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came. What could he say? The truth was a weight he'd carried for years, a truth he'd buried so deep he'd convinced himself it didn't exist. But now, standing here, staring into her eyes, he knew he couldn't run from it anymore. The boy stirred, lifting his head just enough to peek at Michael. Those eyes, those haunting, familiar eyes, were like a mirror reflecting a past Michael had tried to erase. He felt his knees buckle, but he forced himself to stay upright. The photograph in his hand slipped, fluttering to the wet pavement, landing face up in a puddle. It was her, years younger, smiling under a street lamp, her hair damp from a different rain, a different night. And next to her, barely visible in the faded image, was a man who looked like him, younger, softer, someone who still believed in promises. "I didn't know," Michael whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "I swear, I didn't know." But even as he said it, doubt gnawed at him. Had he truly not known, or had he chosen to forget? The woman's gaze didn't waver, but her lips trembled, betraying the storm of emotions she was holding back. She tightened her grip on the boy, as if shielding him from the man who stood before them, a man who was both a stranger and something far more dangerous. The diner's neon sign buzzed, casting a sickly green glow over the scene. A car sped by, its headlights briefly illuminating the tension between them before plunging them back into shadow. Michael took a step forward, his polished shoes splashing in the puddles, but she stepped back, her movement instinctive, protective. "Don't," she said, her voice breaking for the first time. "You don't get to do this. Not now. Not when we've built a life without you." The words hit him harder than the rain, harder than the guilt that had been clawing at him since the moment he saw her face again. He wanted to scream that he hadn't meant to abandon them, that he hadn't known about the boy, that his life had been a series of calculated moves to bury the pain of that one night 6 years ago. But the truth was messier, uglier. He had walked away. He had chosen to forget. And now, the consequences of that choice stood before him, wrapped in a worn coat, staring at him with eyes that demanded answers he wasn't sure he could give. The boy whimpered, and she bent down, whispering something soft and soothing, her voice a stark contrast to the venom she directed at Michael. For a moment, he envied the child, envied the warmth of her love, a love he'd once felt but had let slip through his fingers. He remembered her laugh, the way it had filled the silence of that rainy night 6 years ago, the way it had made him feel alive for the first time in years. He remembered the promise he'd made, whispered under a flickering street lamp, a promise he'd broken without ever looking back. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said finally, his voice steadier now, though it cost him everything to keep it that way. "I just need you to know that I'm here now. And I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Her eyes flickered with something, anger, pain, maybe even a trace of hope, but it was gone as quickly as it came. She straightened, pulling the boy closer, and turned to walk away. The rain swallowed her figure, blurring her into the night, leaving Michael alone with the photograph and the weight of a life he'd thrown away. He stood there, frozen, as the diner's sign flickered one last time before going dark. The world felt heavier, the air thicker, as if the universe itself was pressing down on him, demanding he face what he'd done. He didn't know her name, not anymore, not after all these years, but he knew her face, her voice, the way her presence had once made him believe in something bigger than himself. And now, he knew the boy, a child who carried his eyes, his blood, a child he'd never known existed until this moment. The rain began to ease, slowing to a drizzle, but Michael didn't move. He couldn't. Not yet. His mind was already racing backward, pulling him to a time when the world was simpler, when he was just a man standing under a street lamp, offering a stranger his jacket in the rain. He could still see her smile, hesitant but warm, the way her fingers had brushed against his as she took the jacket. He could hear his own voice, reckless and certain, promising her he'd find her again. How had it all gone so wrong? How had he let that moment slip away, let it become nothing more than a faded photograph in a life he barely recognized? 6 years ago, he'd been someone else, someone who still believed in second chances, someone who hadn't yet built an empire on the ruins of his own heart. He'd been a man who could stand in the rain and feel something other than regret. But that man was gone, buried under years of ambition, wealth, and a carefully curated loneliness that had kept him safe from the chaos of love. Or so he'd thought. Now, as he stared at the empty space where she'd stood, he realized that safety had come at a cost he could never repay. He bent down, picking up the photograph from the puddle. The ink was smudged, her face distorted by the water, but he could still make out the curve of her smile, the light in her eyes. He slipped it into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of his car keys. He could drive away, leave this moment behind, pretend it had never happened. It would be easy. He'd done it before. But as he looked out into the night, where she and the boy had disappeared, he knew he couldn't. Not this time. The city hummed around him, indifferent to the war raging inside his chest. He took a deep breath, the damp air filling his lungs, and made a silent vow. He didn't know how, or if it was even possible, but he would find her. He would face the truth, no matter how much it hurt. And he would make things right, not for himself, but for the boy with his eyes, and for the woman who had once made him believe he could be more than what he'd become. The rain stopped, and the clouds parted just enough to let a sliver of moonlight break through. Michael turned and walked toward his car, his steps slow but deliberate. The photograph burned in his pocket, a reminder of a promise he'd broken and a chance he didn't deserve but would fight for anyway. Somewhere in the city, she was out there, carrying the weight of their shared past. And he would find her, even if it took the rest of his life. 6 years ago, the city was softer, its edges blurred by a different kind of rain, not the punishing deluge of tonight, but a gentle drizzle that seemed to whisper secrets to anyone who listened. Michael Lancaster was 28, a rising star in a world of glass towers and ruthless ambition, but not yet the untouchable CEO he'd become. Back then, he still carried a spark of something human, something that hadn't been polished away by wealth or cynicism. He was restless, though, always chasing a horizon he couldn't quite see, and that night, he found himself at a wedding reception he had no business attending, dragged there by a cousin who thought Michael needed to loosen up. The venue was a sprawling estate, all chandeliers and velvet drapes, the kind of place that reeked of old money and older grudges. Michael stood at the edge of the ballroom, a glass of champagne in hand, watching the crowd with the detached curiosity of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. The music was too loud, the laughter too forced, and the air was thick with the scent of perfume and pretense. He was about to slip out, to disappear into the night as he so often did, when he saw her. She was a server, moving through the crowd with a tray of drinks, her movements careful but not quite practiced, as if she hadn't been doing this long. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, strands escaping to frame her face, and her uniform was slightly too big, the sleeves slipping down her wrists. She didn't belong here, not in this glittering cage of wealth and privilege, and maybe that's why Michael noticed her. She was real, a flicker of authenticity in a room full of masks. He watched as she navigated the crowd, dodging elbows and sidestepping drunken guests with a quiet grace. But then, disaster struck. A man in a tuxedo, gesturing wildly to make a point, knocked into her, sending her tray crashing to the floor. Glasses shattered, wine splashed across the marble, and the room seemed to pause, all eyes turning to her. She froze, her face flushing with embarrassment, and for a moment, Michael thought she might cry. But she didn't. Instead, she dropped to her knees, gathering the broken glass with trembling hands, ignoring the whispers and stares. Something in him stirred, a pull he couldn't explain. Before he knew it, he was moving toward her, shrugging off his jacket as he knelt beside her. "Here," he said, his voice low, handing her the jacket to shield her hands from the shards. She looked up, startled, her eyes meeting his for the first time. They were wide, a deep brown that held a mix of gratitude and wariness, like she wasn't used to kindness and didn't quite trust it. "You don't have to," she started, but he shook his head, picking up a piece of glass and placing it carefully on the tray. They worked in silence, the noise of the party fading into the background. He could feel the weight of curious glances, but he didn't care. For the first time that night, he felt anchored, tethered to this moment, to her. When the last of the glass was cleared, she stood, brushing her hands on her apron, and offered him a small, hesitant smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Most people wouldn't have bothered." "Most people are idiots," he replied, and her smile widened, just enough to show a hint of warmth. He handed her back the tray, their fingers brushing for a fleeting second, and he felt a jolt, like static electricity but deeper, more alive. She glanced down, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear, and he noticed a thin red thread tied around her wrist, frayed but deliberate, like a promise she'd made to herself. "I'm Michael," he said, surprising himself. He didn't usually offer his name, didn't usually care to. But there was something about her, something that made him want to linger. She hesitated, as if weighing whether to share her own, then said, "Anna." It was a simple name, unadorned, but it felt like a gift, one he didn't deserve but wanted to hold on to. The moment was broken by a shout from across the room, a manager barking at her to get back to work. Anna's smile faltered, and she nodded quickly at Michael before hurrying away, disappearing into the crowd. He stood there, his jacket still in his hands, the faint scent of her, something clean, like soap and rain, lingering in the air. He told himself he'd find her later, maybe slip her a tip or just see that smile again. But the night wore on, and she was gone, swallowed by the chaos of the event, and he was left with nothing but the memory of her eyes and the strange, unfamiliar ache in his chest. As he left the estate, the drizzle had turned into a steady rain, and he stood under a street lamp, letting the water soak through his shirt. He could still see her, the way she'd knelt on the floor, unafraid of the mess, unbowed by the judgment around her. He could still hear her voice, soft but sure, saying his name. And he made a promise to himself, reckless and raw, he'd find her again. He didn't know how, didn't know why it mattered so much, but he knew he couldn't let her slip away. That night, as he drove back to his apartment, the city lights blurring through the rain-streaked windshield, he felt alive in a way he hadn't in years. Anna. The name echoed in his mind, a melody he couldn't shake. He didn't know where she lived, didn't know anything about her beyond that moment, but he believed, foolishly, perhaps, that fate would bring them together again. He didn't yet know how fragile fate could be, how easily a single night could be buried under the weight of time and choices. He didn't know that 6 years later, he'd stand in another rain, staring at her face, her eyes no longer warm but filled with a pain he'd caused. He didn't know that the boy she held would carry his features, his blood, a living reminder of a promise he'd broken. All he knew, in that moment, was that he'd met someone who made him want to be better, someone who made him believe, if only for a night, that he could be more than the sum of his ambitions. The rain had stopped by the time Anna made it back to her apartment, a cramped, dimly lit room on the edge of the city where the streetlights flickered and the walls smelled faintly of mildew. Her coat was still damp, clinging to her shoulders as she set her bag down on the warped linoleum floor. The boy, Ethan, was asleep in her arms, his small chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of trust that only a child could muster. She carried him to the narrow bed in the corner, tucking him in with a threadbare blanket, her fingers lingering on his cheek. He looked so much like him, those eyes, that curve of his jaw, and every time she saw it, her heart twisted, a quiet ache that never quite went away. She moved to the kitchen, if you could call it that, a single counter with a hot plate and a sink that dripped no matter how tightly she turned the faucet. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, its hands worn from years of counting hours she'd spent scraping by. She poured herself a glass of water, her hands still trembling from the encounter in the diner's parking lot. Michael's face, older now, hardened by time, had been a shock she wasn't prepared for. She'd spent years convincing herself she'd never see him again, that the man who'd knelt beside her in that ballroom was a fleeting dream, not a promise. But there he was, standing in the rain, looking at her like she was a ghost he'd been running from his whole life. She sat at the small table, her eyes drifting to a wooden box tucked under a stack of bills. It was old, the varnish chipped, a relic from a life that felt like someone else's. She hesitated, then pulled it out, opening the lid with a care that bordered on reverence. Inside was a single item, a cufflink, silver and simple, its surface scratched from the night it had fallen from his sleeve. She'd found it on the floor after the wedding reception, after he'd helped her clean up the shattered glass, after he'd looked at her like she was more than just a server who'd made a mistake. She'd kept it, not because it was valuable, but because it was proof that night had been real, that for a moment, someone had seen her. Anna closed her eyes, letting the memory wash over her. She could still feel the weight of the tray in her hands, the sting of humiliation as the glasses crashed to the floor. She'd been 22, new to the city, working 3 jobs to send money back to her mother, who was fading under the weight of illness and debt. That night, she'd been exhausted, her feet aching, her heart heavy with the knowledge that no matter how hard she worked, it was never enough. And then he'd appeared, kneeling beside her, his presence steady and unassuming, like he didn't care that a room full of people was watching. His voice, low and calm, had cut through her panic, and for the first time in months, she'd felt like she could breathe. She hadn't expected him to stay, to help her gather every shard, to shield her from the manager's sharp words. She hadn't expected the warmth in his eyes, or the way his smile made her forget, just for a moment, how small her world had become. When he'd said his name, Michael, she'd held on to it like a secret, something to carry with her through the long nights and longer days. She hadn't dared to hope for more, not really, but when he promised to find her again, she'd let herself believe it, if only for a night. The memory faded, and Anna opened her eyes, staring at the cufflink in her palm. She'd been so naive back then, so quick to trust a stranger's words. She'd waited for him, checking the staff roster for his name, lingering at the venue in case he came back. But he never did. Weeks turned into months, and the hope she'd clung to withered, replaced by the harsh reality of her life. She'd learned she was pregnant not long after, a discovery that had terrified her but also given her a reason to keep going. Ethan was her everything now, her reason to wake up each morning, to work until her hands were raw, to smile even when her heart was breaking. She stood, moving to the window, where the city sprawled out in a tangle of lights and shadows. Somewhere out there, Michael was probably back in his world, a place of glass offices and private cars, a place where people like her didn't exist. She wondered what he'd thought when he saw Ethan, when he saw those eyes that mirrored his own. Did he feel the same jolt she had, the same mix of fear and recognition? Or was he already forgetting them, tucking them away like he'd tucked away that night 6 years ago? Anna's fingers tightened around the cufflink, its edges pressing into her skin. She wanted to hate him, to let the anger she'd felt in the parking lot consume her. But hate was too simple, too clean. What she felt was Messier, a tangle of longing, regret, and a quiet, stubborn hope she couldn't quite kill. She'd built a life without him, a small, fragile life held together by love and sheer will. She didn't need him, not anymore. But the way he'd looked at her tonight, the way his voice had cracked when he said he didn't know, it stirred something in her, something she wasn't ready to face. She returned the cufflink to its box, closing the lid with a soft click. Ethan stirred in his sleep, murmuring something she couldn't make out. She crossed the room, smoothing the blanket over him, her heart swelling with a love so fierce it scared her sometimes. He was her anchor, her reason, her proof that even the hardest moments could lead to something beautiful. Whatever Michael did next, whether he chased them or disappeared again, she would protect this life, this boy, with everything she had. The city outside was quiet now, the rain a distant memory. Anna leaned against the wall, exhaustion settling into her bones. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, didn't know if Michael's words were just another promise he wouldn't keep. But as she looked at Ethan, sleeping soundly, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years, the possibility of a future where the past didn't have to hurt so much. The morning after the rain-soaked confrontation, Anna woke to the sound of Ethan's laughter, a bright, unguarded sound that cut through the heaviness in her chest. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by a scattering of crayons, drawing on a piece of scrap paper. She watched him for a moment, her heart softening at the way his tongue poked out in concentration, his small hands gripping the crayons with purpose. The drawing was a jumble of colors, blue swirls for the sky, green scribbles for grass, and a figure in black that could only be a man in a suit. She didn't let herself linger on who it might be. She moved quietly, starting the day's routine, boiling water for oatmeal, folding the blanket on Ethan's bed, checking the stack of bills on the table. Routine was her anchor, a way to keep the chaos of last night at bay. But as she stirred the oatmeal, her eyes kept drifting to the wooden box on the counter, where the cufflink lay hidden. Michael's face flashed in her mind, his shock, his trembling hands, the way he'd looked at Ethan like he was seeing a ghost. She shook her head, trying to push the memory away, but it clung to her, stubborn and sharp. The day was busy, as always. Anna worked a double shift at the bakery, her hands moving automatically as she kneaded dough and piped frosting onto cupcakes. The bakery was small, its walls lined with faded photos of cakes from years past, and it smelled of sugar and warmth, a stark contrast to the cold reality of her life. She liked it here, though, liked the rhythm of the work, the way it let her lose herself in something tangible. But today, her thoughts kept wandering, snagging on the man she'd seen in the rain, the man she'd once believed might change everything. During a lull, she flipped through a local newspaper left on the counter, her fingers pausing on a headline, Lancaster Corporate Expands Downtown, CEO Michael Lancaster announces new charity initiative. There he was, in a crisp black and white photo, his jaw set, his eyes distant but familiar. The sight of him, so polished and untouchable, made her stomach twist. She skimmed the article, catching phrases like, philanthropic vision, and, giving back to the community, words that felt hollow after last night's raw encounter. Had he always been this man, hiding behind a veneer of good intentions? Or had something changed him, the way that night 6 years ago had changed her? She tucked the newspaper away, her hands unsteady. The memory of their meeting at the wedding reception was vivid again, the way he'd knelt beside her, his jacket shielding her hands, his voice cutting through the noise of the crowd. She'd replayed that moment so many times, searching for clues, for some hint of who he really was. Back then, she'd seen kindness, a spark of something genuine. But now, standing in the bakery with flour on her apron, she wondered if she'd been wrong, if she'd built him up in her mind into someone he'd never been. The bell above the door chimed, and Anna looked up, expecting another customer. Instead, it was Sarah, her coworker, carrying a delivery order. "Got a big one for you," Sarah said, handing her a slip of paper. "Some fancy office downtown. They want a dozen of those chocolate tarts by noon." Anna glanced at the address, and her breath caught, Lancaster Corporation. She stared at the words, her pulse quickening. It was a coincidence, it had to be. But the red thread around her wrist felt heavier, like it was pulling her towards something she wasn't ready to face. She took the delivery, telling herself it was just a job, nothing more. The office was a sleek tower of glass and steel, its lobby gleaming with marble and modern art. Anna felt out of place, her bakery apron a stark contrast to the suited professionals bustling around her. She carried the box of tarts to the reception desk, her steps measured, her eyes scanning the space for any sign of him. The receptionist, a young woman with a practiced smile, took the box and handed her a clipboard to sign. Anna's hand hovered over the paper, her gaze catching on the name at the top, Michael Lancaster, CEO. "Everything okay?" the receptionist asked, and Anna nodded quickly, scribbling her signature. She turned to leave, but as she did, the elevator doors opened, and there he was. Michael stepped out, his suit impeccable, his expression focused as he spoke to an assistant trailing behind him. Their eyes met for a fleeting second, and Anna's heart lurched. She saw a flicker of recognition in his gaze, a momentary pause, but then he looked away, continuing his conversation as if she were invisible. She hurried out, the cool air of the street a relief against her flushed skin. Her hands shook as she adjusted the strap of her bag, the red thread on her wrist catching the sunlight. Had he recognized her? Or had she imagined that brief spark in his eyes? She wanted to believe he hadn't seen her, that this was just another near miss in a city full of them. But as she walked back to the bakery, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the past was no longer content to stay buried. Back at the bakery, Sarah noticed her distraction. "You okay, Anna? You look like you've seen a ghost." Anna forced a smile, shaking her head. "Just tired," she said, but Sarah's eyes narrowed, unconvinced. "Was it that delivery? Those corporate types can be intense." Anna didn't respond, busying herself with wiping down the counter. She didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to give voice to the turmoil churning inside her. That night, as she tucked Ethan into bed, he clutched her hand, his small fingers warm against hers. "Mommy, why do you wear that string?" he asked, pointing to the red thread. Anna hesitated, her throat tight. "It's a reminder," she said softly. "Of something important." He nodded, satisfied, and closed his eyes, but Anna stayed there, watching him sleep, the weight of her words settling over her. The thread was a reminder of a night when she'd felt seen, of a man who'd promised her more than he could give, of a life she'd had to build without him. She stood, moving to the window, where the city lights glittered like a promise she no longer believed in. Michael was out there, closer than he'd been in years, and the thought both terrified and electrified her. She didn't know what he'd do next, didn't know if he'd seek her out or let her fade back into the shadows. But as she touched the red thread, she felt a spark of resolve. Whatever happened, she would protect Ethan, protect the life they'd built. And if Michael came looking, she'd be ready, not for him, but for herself. The air in the conference room was crisp, scented with polished wood and the faint tang of coffee, a world away from the sticky warmth of the bakery. Anna stood near the back, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, the box of chocolate tarts balanced carefully on the table. She'd been summoned here by a last-minute request from Lancaster Corp., an order for a board meeting that had come with an unusual instruction. The baker herself was to deliver and present the desserts. It felt like a trap, a twist of fate she couldn't escape, and as she adjusted the red thread on her wrist, she braced herself for what was coming. The room was filling with executives, their voices a low hum of confidence and control. Anna kept her eyes down, focusing on the tarts, their glossy surfaces arranged in perfect rows. She told herself she was just doing her job, that this was no different from any other delivery. But her pulse betrayed her, quickening with every step she heard approaching the door. And then, there he was. Michael Lancaster entered, his presence commanding the room without effort, his suit as sharp as the edges of his reputation. He didn't look at her, not at first, his attention fixed on the documents in his hand, his voice clipped as he addressed the group. "Thank you all for coming," he said, settling into the head of the table. "Let's make this quick." The meeting began, a blur of numbers and strategies that Anna barely registered. She stood silently, waiting for the moment she'd be asked to step forward, her heart a drumbeat in her chest. When the agenda shifted to refreshments, an assistant gestured for her to present the tarts. She took a deep breath, stepping into the light, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "These are our signature chocolate tarts," she began, her words practiced but soft, made with dark cocoa and a touch of sea salt for balance. She moved around the table, placing a tart on each plate, her movements deliberate, her eyes avoiding Michael's. But she could feel his gaze, a weight that made her skin prickle. When she reached his place, their hands brushed as she set the plate down, a fleeting contact that sent a jolt through her. She froze for a split second, her breath catching, but he didn't react, his expression unreadable as he nodded politely. "Thank you," he said, his voice neutral, professional, but there was something in the way he said it, a slight hesitation, a crack in the facade. Anna stepped back, retreating to her corner, her mind racing. Did he know it was her? Had he orchestrated this, or was it just another cruel coincidence? She watched him from the corner of her eye, noting the way his fingers tapped the table, the way his jaw tightened when someone mentioned community outreach. He was different here, in this sterile world of power, but those eyes were the same ones that had met hers 6 years ago, under a street lamp in the rain. The meeting dragged on, but Anna's thoughts were elsewhere, caught in the memory of that night. She remembered the way he'd laughed, a sound that had surprised her with its warmth, the way he'd promised to find her again with a certainty she'd wanted to believe. She'd been so young, so ready to see the good in people, and he'd been a beacon in a world that felt impossibly dark. But now, standing in this room, she saw the man he'd become, distant, guarded, a stranger who carried the weight of his choices in the lines of his face. As the meeting wound down, the executives began to leave, their voices fading into the hallway. Anna gathered her things, preparing to slip out unnoticed, but Michael's voice stopped her. "Miss, a moment," he said, and the room seemed to shrink, the air growing thick with anticipation. She turned, meeting his gaze for the first time since the parking lot. His eyes were searching, a mix of curiosity and something deeper, something that made her heart ache. "The tarts were excellent," he said, his tone formal but his eyes locked on hers. "I'd like to discuss a potential contract with your bakery. Could you stay for a few minutes?" It was a reasonable request, one that should have felt like an opportunity, but Anna's stomach twisted. She nodded, unable to trust her voice, and followed him to a smaller office adjacent to the conference room. The door closed behind them, and the silence was deafening. He stood by the window, his back to her for a moment, the city sprawling out below like a map of his empire. When he turned, his expression was softer, less guarded, but still unreadable. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, his voice low, almost a confession. Anna's breath hitched, but she held his gaze, refusing to let him see how much his words affected her. "It's just a job," she said, her voice steady but cold. "I didn't expect to see you either." The lie felt heavy on her tongue, but she needed it, needed the distance it created. He took a step closer, and she noticed the way his hand twitched, as if he wanted to reach out but thought better of it. "Anna," he said, her name a whisper that carried too much weight, "I need to know." "Don't," she cut him off, her voice sharper now, her resolve hardening. "You don't get to say my name like that. Not after everything." His face fell, and for a moment, she saw the man from 6 years ago, the one who'd knelt beside her, who'd made her believe in promises. But that man was gone, and she wasn't the girl who trusted him anymore. He opened his mouth to speak, but she shook her head, stepping back. "I have to go," she said, her voice breaking despite her efforts. She turned, leaving the office, leaving him standing there, the weight of their shared past hanging between them. As she walked through the lobby, her hand brushed the red thread on her wrist, and she felt a pang of something she couldn't name, regret, maybe, or the ghost of a hope she'd buried long ago. Outside, the city was alive, indifferent to the storm inside her. She didn't look back, didn't let herself wonder what he might have said. Ethan was waiting for her, and that was all that mattered. But as she boarded the bus, the memory of Michael's eyes lingered, a question she wasn't ready to answer, a truth she wasn't sure she could face. Anna's days blurred into a rhythm of survival, waking before dawn, dropping Ethan at daycare, and losing herself in the hum of the bakery. But the encounter in Michael's office lingered like a bruise, tender and impossible to ignore. She tried to push it away, focusing on the dough beneath her hands, the laughter of her coworkers, the small joys of Ethan's bedtime stories. Yet, every quiet moment brought his face back, his eyes, searching and haunted, his voice saying her name like it was a confession. She hated how it stirred her, how it made her question the walls she'd built around her heart. A week later, another order came from Lancaster Corp., this time for a charity gala they were hosting. The bakery was tasked with providing desserts, and once again, Anna was requested to oversee the delivery. She wanted to refuse, to send Sarah instead, but the extra pay was too significant to turn down. Ethan's shoes were wearing thin, and the heating bill was overdue. So, she agreed, her stomach nodding as she packed the delicate pastries, each one a reminder of the man she couldn't escape. The gala was held in a grand hotel ballroom, its crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow over tables draped in white linen. Anna arrived early, her apron swapped for a simple black dress the bakery owner had lent her, though she still felt out of place among the glittering crowd. She supervised the dessert table, arranging tarts and eclairs with a precision that belied her racing thoughts. The room buzzed with wealth and power, the air thick with perfume and ambition, and Anna kept her head down, hoping to blend into the background. But Michael was there, of course. She spotted him across the room, his presence magnetic, drawing eyes and smiles as he moved through the crowd. He was in his element, shaking hands, delivering charming remarks, but Anna noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his gaze flickered, as if searching for something, or someone. She turned away, focusing on adjusting a tray, but her hands betrayed her, trembling as she straightened a napkin. The evening wore on, and Anna's role shifted to assisting with the dessert service. His fingers brushed hers, deliberate this time, and Anna felt a spark, a memory of that night 6 years ago when his touch had felt like a promise. She pulled back, her tray a shield, and moved to the next guest, but she could feel his eyes on her, tracking her through the crowd. The weight of his attention was suffocating, and she excused herself, slipping into a service corridor to catch her breath. The hallway was dim, lined with crates and cleaning supplies, a stark contrast to the opulence outside. She leaned against the wall, closing her eyes, trying to steady her racing heart. Footsteps echoed, and she opened her eyes to find Michael standing at the end of the corridor. He looked out of place here, his tailored suit at odds with the utilitarian space, but his expression was raw, unguarded. "Anna," he said, his voice a mix of relief and desperation. "I didn't think you'd come." "I'm working," she replied, her tone clipped, though her voice wavered. "This isn't about you." She straightened, ready to walk past him, but he stepped closer, not blocking her but close enough to make her pause. His eyes were intense, searching, and she hated how they made her feel, seen, exposed, like the girl she'd been 6 years ago. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said, the words tumbling out like they'd been trapped too long. "About that night, about what I said, what I didn't do. I need to understand." He stopped, his hand reaching out but hovering in the air, as if afraid to touch her. Anna's breath hitched, her resolve fraying. She wanted to scream at him, to demand why he'd forgotten her, why he'd let her carry their son alone. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, her eyes fell on a small detail, a cufflink on his shirt, identical to the one she kept in her wooden box. The sight of it hit her like a physical blow, a confirmation of what she'd both feared and hoped, that night had meant something to him, too, even if he'd buried it. "You kept it," she whispered, more to herself than to him, her fingers brushing the red thread on her wrist. He followed her gaze, his expression shifting from confusion to recognition. "The cufflink," he said, his voice barely audible. "I lost its pair years ago, at a wedding." He trailed off, his eyes widening as the pieces clicked into place. "Anna, was that you?" She didn't answer, couldn't. The corridor felt too small, the air too thick. She turned, walking back toward the ballroom, her steps unsteady. Michael called after her, but she didn't stop, couldn't let herself fall into the trap of his words again. She rejoined the gala, her tray empty now, her heart heavier than ever. The red thread burned against her skin, a reminder of a promise that had broken her, and a man who was dangerously close to breaking her again. As she moved through the crowd, she caught sight of Michael re-entering the room, his face pale, his eyes scanning for her. She turned away, blending into the sea of guests, her mind a tangle of fear and longing. Ethan's face flashed in her thoughts, his innocent questions about the red thread, his drawings of a man in a suit. She didn't know what Michael wanted, didn't know if she could trust the man he'd become. But as she left the gala, the night air cool against her skin, she felt a shift, a crack in the armor she'd worn for so long. The truth was coming, whether she was ready or not. The bakery was quiet the next morning, the scent of fresh bread mingling with the faint tang of lemon cleaner. Anna worked alone, her hands moving through the familiar motions of rolling dough and filling trays, but her mind was elsewhere, tangled in the memory of Michael's voice in the service corridor, the way he'd said her name like it was a lifeline. The red thread on her wrist felt heavier, a constant reminder of the past she couldn't outrun. She glanced at the clock. Ethan would be at daycare for another few hours, giving her time to think, though thinking was the last thing she wanted to do. The bell above the door chimed, and Anna looked up, expecting an early customer. Instead, it was Michael. He stood in the doorway, his suit slightly rumpled, his expression a mix of determination and uncertainty. The sight of him in her space, this small haven she'd carved out for herself, felt like an invasion. She wiped her hands on her apron, her heart pounding, and forced her voice to stay steady. "We're not open yet," she said, though the words felt hollow. "I'm not here for pastries," he replied, his voice low, careful. He stepped inside, letting the door close behind him, the soft jingle of the bell echoing in the silence. "Anna, we need to talk." His eyes were fixed on her, searching, and she hated how they made her feel exposed, like he could see every scar she'd hidden over the years. "There's nothing to say," she said, turning back to the counter, busying herself with a tray of croissants. But her hands shook, betraying her, and she knew he saw it. He moved closer, stopping just short of the counter, his presence a quiet force that filled the room. "There's everything to say," he countered, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "I saw the thread last night. I saw the cufflink. I know it was you, Anna, that night at the wedding. And I need to know what happened after." She froze, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. The weight of his words pressed against her, demanding answers she wasn't ready to give. She wanted to tell him to leave, to take his questions and his guilt and disappear, but something in his voice, the raw edge of it, the same vulnerability she'd seen in the rain, made her pause. She turned to face him, her eyes hard but her resolve wavering. "You don't get to walk in here and demand answers," she said, her voice low, controlled. "You left, Michael. You made a promise, and you broke it. That's what happened." His face tightened, a flicker of pain crossing his features. "I didn't know," he said, his voice breaking. "I looked for you, Anna. I went back to the venue, asked around, but no one knew who you were. I didn't have your last name, didn't have anything but a memory of that night. I thought," he stopped, running a hand through his hair, his composure fraying. "I thought you were gone." Anna's chest ached, the truth of his words clashing with the years of hurt she'd carried. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe he'd tried, but the reality of her life, alone, pregnant, struggling to survive, made his words feel like too little, too late. "You thought I was gone," she repeated, her voice sharp. "And that was enough for you to move on, to build your empire, to forget. But I didn't have that luxury, Michael. I had a child. Your child." The words hung between them, heavy and unyielding. Michael's eyes widened, his breath catching as the truth settled over him. "The boy," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Ethan." Hearing her son's name on his lips felt like a violation, and Anna's hands clenched into fists. "Don't," she said, her voice trembling now. "You don't get to say his name. You don't know him. You don't know us." "I want to," he said, stepping closer, his voice urgent. "Anna, I swear, I didn't know. If I had, I would've." He stopped, his words faltering as he saw the disbelief in her eyes. "I would have been there," he finished, but the words sounded hollow, even to him. Anna shook her head, tears burning at the edges of her vision, but she refused to let them fall. "You weren't," she said, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "You weren't there when I was scared, when I was alone, when I had to figure out how to be a mother without a single person to lean on. You weren't there when Ethan was born, when he took his first steps, when he asked why he didn't have a dad like the other kids. You don't get to walk in now and act like you can fix it." Michael's face crumpled, and for a moment, he looked like the man from 6 years ago, the one who'd knelt beside her in the chaos of a spilled tray, who'd made her feel seen. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice raw. "I know it's not enough, but I'm here now, Anna. I want to make this right. For you, for Ethan." She stared at him, her heart torn between anger and a fragile, dangerous hope. She thought of Ethan's drawings, the man in the suit, the questions she couldn't answer. She thought of the cufflink in her wooden box, the red thread on her wrist, the pieces of a life she tried to bury. "I don't know if you can," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can trust you." He nodded, his eyes glistening with something that looked like tears. "Let me try," he said. "Please, Anna. Let me try." The sincerity in his voice was almost too much, a crack in the armor she'd worn for so long. She didn't respond, couldn't find the words, but she didn't tell him to leave, either. The silence stretched, filled with the weight of everything unsaid. The bell chimed again, and Sarah walked in, her cheerful greeting faltering as she sensed the tension. "Oh, sorry," she said, glancing between them. She gestured vaguely, retreating to the back. Anna used the interruption to step away, moving behind the counter, putting distance between her and Michael. "I have work to do," she said, her voice firmer now. "You should go." He hesitated, then nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I'll come back," he said, not a threat but a promise, one that sent a shiver through her. He turned and left, the bell jingling softly as the door closed. Anna stood there, her hands gripping the counter, the red thread a burning reminder of a past that refused to stay buried. Ethan's laughter echoed in her mind, and she knew, whatever happened next, she'd protect him, even if it meant facing the man who'd broken her heart. The city was alive with the hum of late afternoon, the streets buzzing with workers spilling out of offices and the distant wail of a siren cutting through the noise. Anna sat on a park bench, watching Ethan chase a pigeon across the grass, his giggles a bright spot in the gray haze of her thoughts. The red thread on her wrist caught the sunlight, a quiet reminder of the conversation in the bakery, Michael's plea echoing in her mind. "Let me try." She'd sent him away, but his words clung to her, stirring a restlessness she couldn't shake. Ethan ran back, his cheeks flushed, a dandelion clutched in his small hand. "For you, Mommy," he said, holding it out with a grin. Anna took it, her heart swelling, and pulled him onto her lap. "Thank you, sweet boy," she murmured, kissing his forehead. His warmth grounded her, a reminder of why she'd fought so hard to build this life, why she'd kept going even when the weight of the world felt crushing. But as she looked at his face, those eyes, so like Michael's, she felt a pang of fear. What would it mean to let Michael in, to risk disrupting the fragile balance she'd created? She hadn't told Ethan about the man in the suit, the one who'd appeared in the rain and then in her bakery, the one whose name she'd carried like a secret for years. How could she explain it to a 5-year-old who saw the world in crayons and dandelions? But Ethan was perceptive, picking up on her silences, her distracted glances. "Mommy, are you sad?" he asked now, his voice small, his hand resting on her cheek. "No, baby," she lied, forcing a smile. "Just thinking." He nodded, accepting her answer, and slid off her lap to chase another pigeon. Anna watched him, her mind drifting to the wooden box at home, the cufflink inside it, the tangible proof of a night that had changed everything. She'd kept it hidden, a relic of a moment she'd both cherished and resented, but now it felt like a key to a door she wasn't sure she wanted to open. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Sarah, * another order from Lancaster Corporation. "They want you specifically. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. * Anna's stomach twisted. She wanted to refuse, to cut this thread that kept pulling her back to Michael, but the bakery needed the business, and she needed the money. She typed a quick reply, *OK*, and slipped the phone back into her pocket, her fingers brushing the red thread. It was fraying now, worn from years of wear, but she couldn't bring herself to take it off. The next morning, Anna arrived at Lancaster Corp., a box of pastries in her arms, her nerves taut as a wire. The lobby was as imposing as before, all glass and marble, a testament to Michael's success. She was directed to a conference room, smaller than the last, with a view of the city skyline. Michael was already there, alone, standing by the window, his silhouette sharp against the morning light. He turned as she entered, his expression softening, though his eyes held a cautious hope. "Anna," he said, his voice warm but restrained. "Thank you for coming." She set the box on the table, keeping her movements brisk, professional. "It's just a delivery," she said, echoing her words from the gala, but the lie felt thinner now, stretched to its breaking point. He stepped closer, not crowding her but close enough to make the air feel charged. "I ordered the pastries," he admitted, his voice low. "But I needed to see you. To talk." She crossed her arms, her defenses up, the red thread hidden beneath her sleeve. "You can't keep doing this, Michael," she said, her voice steady but laced with exhaustion. "You can't keep showing up, asking for pieces of a life you walked away from." His face tightened, but he didn't look away, didn't retreat. "I know I hurt you," he said. "I know I failed you. But I'm not walking away now. I want to know Ethan. I want to be part of his life, if you'll let me." The words hit her like a wave, stirring a mix of anger and longing she'd buried deep. She thought of Ethan's drawings, his questions about the red thread, the father he didn't know. "You don't get to decide that," she said, her voice shaking. "You don't get to waltz in and claim him like he's a business deal. He's my son, Michael. I've raised him alone, loved him alone, protected him alone. What makes you think you deserve him now?" Michael's eyes glistened, his hands clenching at his sides. "I don't," he said, his voice raw. "I don't deserve him, or you. But I'm here, Anna, and I'm not going anywhere. I'll do whatever it takes, whatever you need, to prove I can be the man I should have been 6 years ago." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, worn photograph, the same one he dropped in the rain, her younger self smiling under a street lamp. "I kept this," he said, his voice breaking. "All these years, I kept it, even when I didn't understand why. It was you, Anna. It's always been you." Her throat tightened, tears threatening to spill. She looked at the photograph, at the girl she'd been, so full of hope, and felt the weight of everything she'd lost, and everything she'd gained. Ethan's laughter echoed in her mind, a reminder of the life she'd built without Michael, a life that was enough. But as she met Michael's eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected, not just guilt, but a determination that mirrored her own, a willingness to fight for something he'd only just begun to understand. "I need time," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to think about what's best for Ethan, not for you, not for me." Michael nodded, relief flickering across his face, though he didn't push her further. "I'll wait," he said. "As long as it takes." He stepped back, giving her space, and she felt a shift, a crack in the wall she'd built around her heart. She left the conference room, the box of pastries lighter but her heart heavier. The city outside was a blur, the red thread a quiet pulse against her wrist. She didn't know if she could trust Michael, didn't know if she could let him into Ethan's life, or her own. But as she walked toward the daycare, Ethan's face waiting for her, she felt a spark of possibility, fragile but real, like the first light after a long, dark night. The daycare was a riot of color, its walls plastered with finger paintings and paper cutouts, the air filled with the chatter of children and the squeak of sneakers on linoleum. Anna stood at the edge of the room, watching Ethan stack blocks with a focus that made her smile despite the weight in her chest. His small hands moved with purpose, building a wobbly tower that teetered but didn't fall. She wanted to freeze this moment, to keep him here, safe in a world where the complexities of the past couldn't touch him. But Michael's words from the conference room echoed in her mind, "I'll wait. As long as it takes asterisk," and she knew the past was no longer content to stay silent. She'd spent the night wrestling with his request, her thoughts a tangle of fear, hope, and the fierce protectiveness that had defined her life since Ethan was born. The red thread on her wrist was fraying more each day, a physical reminder of how time had worn down her defenses. She'd kept it as a symbol of that night with Michael, a night that had given her both her greatest pain and her greatest joy. Now, it felt like a tether, pulling her toward a decision she wasn't ready to make. Ethan looked up, spotting her, and his face lit up with a grin that melted her resolve. "Mommy," he called, abandoning his blocks to run into her arms. She scooped him up, breathing in the familiar scent of crayons and baby shampoo, her heart aching with love. "Ready to go home, sweet boy?" she asked, and he nodded, clutching a crumpled drawing he'd made, a house, a sun, and 3 stick figures holding hands. She didn't ask who the third figure was, but the question burned in her chest. At home, Anna went through their evening routine, dinner, bath, story time, her movements automatic but her mind elsewhere. Ethan's chatter about his day grounded her, his stories of playground adventures a reminder of the life she'd built for them. But as she tucked him into bed, he reached for her wrist, his small fingers tracing the red thread. "Is it a magic string?" he asked, his voice sleepy but curious. She hesitated, her throat tight. "It's a special string," she said softly. "It reminds me of someone important." Ethan's eyes widened, but he didn't press further, his eyelids drooping as sleep claimed him. Anna stayed there, watching his chest rise and fall, the drawing he'd made still clutched in her hand. The third stick figure loomed in her mind, a shadow of the man who was no longer just a memory. The next morning, Anna woke with a clarity she hadn't felt in weeks. She couldn't keep running from Michael, couldn't keep pretending the past didn't exist. Ethan deserved to know his father, even if it terrified her to open that door. But it had to be on her terms, for her son's sake. She called Sarah, asking her to cover the bakery for a few hours, and then she dialed the number Michael had left on a business card during their last meeting. Her hands shook as the phone rang, but her voice was steady when he answered. "Anna?" His voice was cautious, hopeful, and she closed her eyes, steeling herself. "I want to talk," she said. "But not at your office. Somewhere neutral. The park by the bakery, noon." He agreed without hesitation, and she hung up, her heart pounding. She spent the morning preparing, packing a small bag for Ethan with snacks and his favorite toy car, her mind racing through what she'd say. The park was quiet when they arrived, the swings swaying gently in the breeze. Ethan ran to the slide, oblivious to the weight of the moment, and Anna sat on a bench, the red thread catching the light. Michael arrived a few minutes later, his suit replaced by a sweater and jeans, a deliberate attempt to seem less imposing. He sat beside her, leaving a careful distance, his eyes on Ethan as he played. "He's incredible," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. "He looks so much like you." Anna nodded, her throat tight. "He's my world," she said, her voice firm. "And that's why I'm here. I've thought about what you said, about wanting to be part of his life. But I need to know you understand what that means. Ethan isn't a project, Michael. He's a person, with feelings and fears, and I won't let him be hurt." Michael's eyes met hers, steady and sincere. "I know," he said. "I know I don't deserve this chance, but I want to be there for him, Anna. Not just with money or things, but with time, with care. I want to learn who he is, to be the father he needs." He paused, his voice softening. "And I want to make things right with you, if you'll let me." Her heart twisted, the weight of his words pulling at the fragile hope she tried to bury. "I don't know if I can," she said honestly. "I don't know if I can trust you, not after everything. But Ethan, he deserves to know you, if you're serious about this." She looked at him, searching his face for the man she'd met 6 years ago, the one who'd knelt beside her in the chaos of a spilled tray. "It has to be slow," she said. "Small steps. And if you hurt him, Michael, I'll never forgive you." He nodded, relief and determination in his eyes. "I understand," he said. "Whatever you need, however long it takes." He glanced at Ethan, who was now digging in the sand, and a small smile touched his lips. "Can I meet him? Just for a moment?" Anna hesitated, her instincts screaming to protect her son, but she saw the sincerity in Michael's face, the longing that mirrored her own when she looked at Ethan. "Okay," she said finally. "But I'm right here." She called Ethan over, and he trotted up, curious but shy, clutching his toy car. "Ethan, this is Michael," she said, her voice gentle. "He's a friend." Ethan studied Michael, his eyes wide, and then held out his car. "Wanna see it go fast?" he asked, and Michael's face lit up, a genuine smile breaking through. "Yeah, buddy," he said, kneeling to Ethan's level. "Show me." As they played, Anna watched, her heart a tangle of fear and possibility, the red thread a quiet pulse against her wrist. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start, a fragile bridge to a future she couldn't yet see. The park became their meeting place, a neutral ground where the past could unfold slowly, like a flower testing the spring air. Anna and Michael met there twice a week, always with Ethan, always under her watchful eye. She kept her distance, sitting on the bench with a book she rarely read, her gaze flickering between her son and the man who was slowly becoming more than a stranger. Michael was patient, following her rules, no gifts, no promises, just time spent playing, talking, learning who Ethan was. He knelt in the grass, pushing toy cars or tossing a ball, his laughter mingling with Ethan's in a way that made Anna's heart ache with both fear and hope. Ethan took to Michael with a child's unguarded trust, his questions about the friend growing bolder. "Does Michael have a car like mine?" he'd ask, or, "Can Michael come to my birthday?" Anna answered carefully, keeping the truth simple, her words a shield for both of them. But she saw the way Ethan's eyes lit up when Michael arrived, the way he'd run to show him a new drawing, and it stirred a quiet terror in her. What if Michael left again? What if this fragile bridge collapsed, leaving Ethan to pick up the pieces? Michael seemed to sense her fear, his actions deliberate, his presence steady. He didn't push for more than she offered, didn't ask to see Ethan outside the park or press for details about their life. But he shared pieces of himself, stories of his childhood, his struggles to build Lancaster Corp., the loneliness that had crept in despite his success. Anna listened, her walls softening but not crumbling, the red thread on her wrist a reminder of the trust she'd lost and the trust she wasn't ready to give. One afternoon, as summer faded into autumn, Michael arrived with a small notebook, its pages worn and creased. Ethan was at the playground, climbing a slide, and Anna sat alone, the air crisp with the scent of fallen leaves. Michael hesitated, then sat beside her, holding out the notebook. "I found this," he said, his voice low. "After we talked in the bakery. I thought you should see it." She took it, her fingers brushing the faded cover, and opened it to find pages filled with his handwriting, notes, sketches, fragments of thoughts. One page caught her eye, dated 6 years ago, a few weeks after the wedding reception. It was a description of her, the girl with the red thread, brown eyes like a storm, stronger than she knows. Below it, a list of venues, names, and phone numbers, all crossed out, a record of his failed search. Anna's breath caught, her fingers tracing the words, the evidence that he tried, that he hadn't entirely forgotten. "I didn't lie," he said softly, watching her. "I looked for you, Anna. I didn't know how to find you, and I let life pull me away. I'm not asking for forgiveness, but I need you to know I carried that night with me, even when I didn't understand why." His eyes were earnest, vulnerable, and for the first time, Anna saw not the CEO or the man who'd broken her heart, but the one who'd knelt beside her, who'd seen her when no one else did. She closed the notebook, her throat tight. "I kept your cufflink," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "All these years, I kept it," even when I hated you. I don't know why. The confession felt like a release, a crack in the armor she'd worn for so long. Michael's eyes softened, but he didn't reach for her, didn't cross the invisible line between them. Maybe we both held on to something, he said. Something we didn't know how to let go of. They sat in silence, the sounds of the park filling the space, Ethan's laughter, the creak of the swings, the rustle of leaves. Anna looked at her son, his small figure a beacon of everything she'd fought for, and felt a shift inside her. She wasn't ready to forgive Michael, not fully, but she was tired of carrying the weight of her anger, tired of running from the possibility of something more. I don't know what this looks like, she said finally, her voice steady. But I'm willing to try, for Ethan's sake. And maybe for mine. Michael's face lit up, a cautious hope breaking through. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'll keep showing up, Anna. I'll keep proving it. She nodded, the red thread catching the light, its frayed edges a symbol of a past that was no longer just pain, but a bridge to something new. Months passed, and the park meetings became a routine, a thread woven into their lives. Michael learned Ethan's favorite colors, his love for dinosaurs, the way he giggled when tickled. He brought small things, a book about T-Rexes, a kite they flew on a windy day, always checking with Anna first, respecting her boundaries. Ethan began to call him Mikey, a nickname that made Michael's eyes shine, and Anna found herself smiling more, the weight of the past lightening with each shared moment. One evening, as winter approached, Anna invited Michael to their apartment for Ethan's 6th birthday. It was a small step, a tentative opening of her world, but it felt monumental. The apartment was warm, filled with the scent of cake and the sound of Ethan's excitement. Michael arrived with a single gift, a toy car, approved by Anna, and knelt to give it to Ethan, their laughter filling the small space. Anna watched from the kitchen, her heart full, the red thread now a faint band, its color faded but its meaning enduring. After Ethan went to bed, clutching his new car, Anna and Michael sat at the table, the silence comfortable for the first time. You're good with him, she said, her voice soft. He trusts you. Michael's eyes met hers, gratitude and something deeper in his gaze. I'm trying to be the man he deserves, he said. And the man you deserve, if you'll let me. She didn't respond, not yet, but she reached across the table, her fingers brushing his, a quiet acknowledgement of the journey they'd begun. The cufflink sat in its box, the notebook in her drawer, the photograph in his wallet, pieces of a past that had shaped them, now part of a future they were building, step by careful step. As Michael left, the city lights glittering outside, Anna stood at the window, the red thread a gentle weight on her wrist. She thought of the girl she'd been, the man who'd promised to find her, the boy who'd given her a reason to keep going. The pain of the past hadn't vanished, but it was softer now, woven into a tapestry of love, resilience, and possibility. Ethan slept soundly, Michael's laughter still echoing in her mind, and for the first time in years, Anna felt not just enough, but whole.